The wire cutters made no sound as they bit through the perimeter fence. Leonidus had chosen the tools himself 3 hours before the insertion, testing each pair against sample metal in the armory until he found the set that whispered instead of screamed. At 58 years old in human terms, which translated to 137 years of actual life, he had learned that wars were won in the preparation, not in the moment of contact. The men behind him understood this without needing to be told. They were sentinels, the oldest of the old guard, and they had followed him through enough operations to know that silence was survival. The compound stretched before them like a wound in the mountain landscape. Northridge territory had once been prosperous, back when the pack controlled the eastern timber roads and the silver mines that ran beneath the peaks. Now the main house sagged under the weight of its own decay, the outbuildings reduced to skeletal frames that the wind moved through with a sound like breathing. Leonidus counted 12 exterior lights, only 7 of them functional, and noted the pattern of their illumination. The gaps between the pools of yellow light were wide enough for a careful man to navigate, and he had brought nothing but careful men with him tonight. Something in the air made his wolf stir with an interest it had not shown in decades. The sensation was subtle, barely more than a whisper of awareness beneath the tactical assessment that consumed most of his attention. But it was there. His lichened senses, honed by over a century of warfare and survival, were detecting something that should not exist in this place. A scent that was almost hidden, masked by layers of chemical bitterness and intentional suppression, but present nonetheless. It made the hair on the back of his neck stand up with a recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the oldest part of his brain. Sentinel Marcus moved through the gap in the fence first, his body low to the ground despite the arthritis that Leonidus knew plagued his joints on cold nights like this. At 61, Marcus was the oldest of them, a weapons master who had trained 3 generations of fighters and buried 2 of his own sons in service to the throne. He cleared the initial approach with hand signals that were economy itself, 2 fingers pointing to the northwest corner where the generator housing provided cover, then a closed fist that meant hold position. Leonidus followed, feeling the familiar weight of his tactical vest settle against his chest, the ceramic plates inside rated to stop anything short of a silver round fired at close range. Behind him came Royce, the quartermaster who questioned every order out of professional paranoia and personal affection. Then Kael, whose medic pack rode high on his shoulders and whose daughter had been taken by traffickers 9 years ago and never found. Darius brought up the rear, the youngest at 38, his hands steady on the suppressed rifle despite the tremor that Leonidus had seen creeping into them over the past 6 months. The mission brief had come through encrypted channels 72 hours prior, a burst transmission from an asset inside the Shadow Council network. The intelligence was sparse but actionable. Latent shifter, female, 21 years old, held in subterranean facility beneath Northridge Alpha's personal residence. The terminology was careful, designed to obscure the truth from anyone monitoring the channels. Latent shifter was the polite term. Trafficked Luna was what it really meant, and that single designation had been enough to put Leonidus on a helicopter heading north within the hour. His wolf had become progressively more agitated during the flight, pacing in the confines of his mind with an urgency that felt entirely inappropriate for a standard extraction operation. Leonidus had dismissed it as residual tension from too many years of similar missions ending in tragedy. But now, standing on the grounds of the compound with that ghost of a scent teasing his senses, he wondered if his instincts had been trying to tell him something his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. They moved through the shadows like water finding the path of least resistance. The compound's security was amateur, the kind of setup that relied on reputation rather than actual defensive infrastructure. 2 guards at the main entrance, both of them bored and cold, stamping their feet against the mountain chill and passing a flask between them that probably held something stronger than coffee. Another guard on the south approach, but he was facing the wrong direction, watching the tree line instead of the blind spot near the storage sheds. Leonidus filed away the tactical failures with the part of his mind that never stopped analyzing, never stopped preparing for the next engagement. Tywin, the Northridge Alpha, had let his territory rot from the inside out, and that rot extended to his security protocols. The exterior door to the sublevel was exactly where the intelligence had indicated, tucked beneath an overhang that kept it invisible from the main approach. Royce was on it immediately, his lockpicks moving with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice. The mechanism was old, mechanical rather than electronic, which meant it could be defeated without triggering any alarms tied to the compound's power grid. The lock gave with a click that sounded like a bone breaking in the silence, and then they were inside, moving down stairs that smelled of damp stone and something else, something bitter and organic that Leonidus recognized immediately as wolfsbane. The scent grew stronger as they descended, and with it came the first whisper of doubt that had plagued Leonidus since accepting this mission. Wolfsbane was a poison, a suppressant used to keep shifters from accessing their wolves, but it required continuous dosing to remain effective. The concentration in the air suggested someone had been ingesting it for months, possibly years, and that kind of exposure did permanent damage to the body and the spirit both. He had seen it before, in prisoners of war who had been held in silver cages and force-fed the bitter extract until they forgot what it meant to be anything other than human. Most of them never recovered, even after liberation. Their wolves were simply gone, burned out like lights extinguished one by one until only darkness remained. But beneath the wolfsbane, beneath the chemical suppressant that should have obliterated any natural scent, there was something else. Something that made his wolf throw itself against the barriers of his control with a violence that shocked him. In 137 years of life, through countless battles and endless political maneuvering, through the parade of females who had been offered as potential mates, and the decades of solitude that followed his repeated rejections, Leonidus had never felt anything like this. It was recognition on a level that transcended choice or logic. It was his wolf screaming that something essential existed in this place, something that belonged to them, something that had been missing for so long he had forgotten to look for it. The corridor at the bottom of the stairs was narrow enough that they had to move single file, and Leonidus felt the walls pressing in with a weight that was more than physical. His heart was beating faster than tactical situations warranted, his breathing controlled, but requiring conscious effort to maintain that control. Every instinct he possessed was telling him to move faster, to get to the source of that scent before something happened to extinguish it. But discipline held him to the practiced pace of a coordinated insertion. Darius was breathing hard behind him, the sound sharp and controlled, and Leonidus recognized the pattern of a man fighting his own demons in real time. Tight spaces did that to Darius, had done that ever since the cave collapse during the mountain campaign 3 years back. The intelligence had indicated 3 possible holding areas in the sublevel, but Leonidus knew which one held their target before they cleared the first room. The air current was different near the eastern wall, a subtle flow that suggested a hidden space behind the stone, and there was a newer lock on what appeared to be a utility closet door. More importantly, the scent was strongest there, concentrated enough that even through the wolfsbane suppression, his wolf could identify it with absolute certainty. Star jasmine and something darker, something that smelled like wildfire and moonlight and every primal thing that civilization had tried to breed out of their species. His hands were not entirely steady as he signaled Marcus, who moved forward with the breaching charge already in hand, the small strip of explosive compound designed to blow hinges without bringing down the entire structure. They had 12 seconds from detonation to entry, 12 seconds before anyone in the compound above would have time to respond to the sound. Marcus set the charge with fingers that showed no tremor at all, then fell back to the safe distance. Leonidus counted down in his head, but his wolf was counting something else entirely, marking the seconds until they would see what the universe had apparently decided belonged to them. At 0, the world erupted in light and sound, and then they were moving through the smoke, weapons up and eyes scanning for threats. The room beyond was smaller than expected, barely 10 feet square, and it smelled like blood and chemicals and despair. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, swaying from the shockwave of the explosion, casting wild shadows across walls that were covered in calculations and maps and what looked like surveillance photos. In the center of the space, chained to a support beam with silver manacles that had burned black marks into the stone, was a young woman who looked like she had been carved from bone and fury. She was not cowering. That was the first thing Leonidas registered with the tactical part of his mind, the detail that cut through the suddenly overwhelming wave of sensation, threatening to drown his ability to think clearly. She was on her feet, her spine straight despite the obvious pain of the silver against her wrists, and in her right hand she held what appeared to be a sharpened piece of metal, probably torn from the frame of the cot in the corner. Her eyes were clear and cold as she tracked their entry, marking each man's position and calculating angles the same way Leonidas himself would have done. And she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional aesthetics and everything to do with the fact that she was breathing and defiant and alive despite everything this place had tried to do to her. Her dark hair hung in a braid over one shoulder, her simple clothes worn but clean, and there was blood on her collar that looked fresh enough to suggest she had recently fought someone and won. Leonidas lowered his weapon with movements that felt disconnected from conscious choice, his body responding to imperatives that overrode a century of tactical training. The wolf inside him was no longer pacing. It was utterly still, focused with an intensity that felt like staring into the sun, and it was saying one word over and over again in a voice that could not be ignored. Mine. Not in the possessive sense of ownership or the brutal claim of dominance, but in the fundamental recognition of connection. This woman, this stranger who held a blade like she knew how to use it and stood her ground against armed intruders without flinching, was his mate. The universe had finally, after more than a century of searching and waiting and giving up hope, provided what his wolf had been missing. And she was in chains, bleeding silver, and looking at him like he might be another threat to survive, rather than the answer to a question she had probably stopped asking years ago. He signaled the others to hold position. His voice, when it emerged rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the effort of maintaining any semblance of professional composure when his entire world had just tilted sideways. "You are bleeding silver. How long have you been taking the wolfsbane?" The practical question, the tactical assessment, because if he allowed himself to acknowledge what he was feeling, he would do something catastrophically stupid like tear the silver manacles off her wrists with his bare hands, and damn the burns it would cost him. The woman did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved over his face with an assessment that was uncomfortably thorough, then down to the insignia on his vest, the silver wolf head that marked him as lichen royalty, and something flickered in her expression that might have been recognition or might have been calculation. She was evaluating him as a potential threat, categorizing his capabilities, and the clinical detachment in her gaze suggested she had learned to survive by being smarter than the people who held her captive. 5 years, and I will take another 5 if it keeps me human. The statement hit him like a physical blow. 5 years of systematic self-poisoning, 5 years of choosing slow death over whatever alternative she had been trying to avoid, and she would do it again because remaining human was worth any cost. The implications were staggering and horrifying in equal measure. But what struck him most was the absolute conviction in her voice. She was not asking for rescue. She was not grateful for their presence. She was telling him that she had chosen this path and would choose it again, and his opinion on the matter was completely irrelevant. His wolf, which should have been enraged by the defiance, instead felt something that was dangerously close to pride. She was strong, she was a survivor, and she was his. Behind him, Cale shifted his weight, the movement barely audible but enough to draw the woman's attention. Her blade came up fractionally, a reflexive, defensive gesture, and Leonidas saw the way her arm trembled with the effort of holding the weapon steady. She was exhausted, pushed past the point where most people would have collapsed, but she was still standing because surrender had never been part of her vocabulary. Cale cleared his throat, his voice carrying the same careful neutrality that Leonidas had used. "Sir, she is combat stressed. Let me approach with the medical kit. I can assess the damage from the silver exposure and determine if immediate treatment is necessary." The woman's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound that had no humor in it at all. "I am not combat stressed. I am combat experienced, and if any of you take one more step into this room, I will use this blade to ensure you regret the decision." Something in Leonidas's chest twisted at the raw defiance in her voice, at the way she was prepared to fight armed soldiers with nothing but a sharpened piece of scrap metal and the absolute certainty that giving up was not an option. This was not a victim waiting to be saved. This was a warrior who had been holding a position for 5 years without reinforcements, and his respect for her competence warred with his wolf's howling demand to eliminate every threat and take her somewhere safe where no one would ever hurt her again. He held up one hand, stopping Kyle before the medic could respond, and forced his voice into something approximating calm professionalism, even though his pulse was hammering and his skin felt too tight. "No one is coming closer. You have earned the right to keep your blade. But we have limited time before the guards upstairs respond to the explosion, and I need information before we proceed." The woman's eyes narrowed, but the blade lowered slightly, and Leonidus took that as permission to continue, even though every word felt inadequate compared to what he wanted to say. "Are you here against your will? Is this a trafficking situation?" The question seemed to confuse her, or perhaps amuse her, because the bitter smile returned to her face, and this time it carried an edge that was almost cruel. "That depends entirely on your definition of will and your understanding of the situation. I assume you received intelligence from the Shadow Council network. I assume they told you I was an asset in need of extraction. Both of those statements are accurate, but not in the way you probably interpreted them." Leonidus felt the world tilt slightly, the way it always did when an operation began to deviate from the mission brief, but underneath the tactical recalibration, his wolf was still focused entirely on the woman in front of him. She was talking about Shadow Council operations and intelligence networks, which meant she was not a simple victim, but something more complex, and that complexity only made his need to protect her more intense rather than less. "Explain." The woman shifted her stance, and Leonidus saw the way the movement cost her, the way the silver manacles dragged at her wrists and left fresh burns on skin that was already scarred with old wounds. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the urge to touch her, to remove the source of her pain, nearly overwhelming his ability to maintain distance. But her voice remained steady, flat, and professional, in a way that reminded him of mission reports delivered under field conditions. "My name is Logartha, and for the past 5 years I have been operating undercover as the latent daughter of Alpha Tywin. My assignment was to infiltrate the Northridge trafficking network, to document the routes and the buyers and the methods of transport, and to feed that intelligence back to my handlers in the Shadow Council. The wolfsbane was my idea, a way to suppress my scent and my wolf so thoroughly that no one would ever suspect I was anything other than what I appeared to be. A failure, a disappointment, a girl with no value beyond what could be negotiated in a contract marriage. Logartha. Her name was Logartha, and she had spent 5 years poisoning herself to maintain a cover identity that allowed her to document trafficking operations from the inside. The courage that required, the sheer force of will necessary to drink poison every morning, knowing it was destroying her from within, left him momentarily speechless. But what registered even more strongly was the confirmation that she was not just strong and defiant. She was skilled and dedicated, and exactly the kind of person his wolf would choose if given the opportunity. She paused, and Leonidus saw the way her throat worked as she swallowed, the gesture betraying the first crack in her armor. 3 days ago, one of the traffickers became suspicious. A man named Harkin, Beta rank, operates independently of the main network. He began asking questions about my background, about why Tywin had never tried to sell me before, about whether my lack of scent was natural or induced. I knew my cover was compromised. I knew extraction was necessary. I sent the signal to my handlers, and I waited. The implications began to unfold in Leonidus's mind like a map revealing its full geography. But underneath the tactical assessment, his wolf was processing different information entirely. She had been in danger. She had called for help, and they had answered, which meant the universe had orchestrated this meeting, even if the Shadow Council had not intended it that way. Marcus spoke from behind him, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen this particular dance play out too many times. "Sir, if she is Shadow Council, then this is not our operation to complete. We should withdraw and let her handlers manage the extraction through proper channels." The suggestion was tactically sound and procedurally correct, and Leonidus would have agreed without hesitation under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and the idea of leaving Logartha in this compound for even 1 more hour while bureaucratic protocols were followed made his wolf snarl with a violence that actually hurt. He looked at the silver manacles, at the burns that went too deep to be fresh, at the calculations on the walls that spoke of months or years of careful documentation. He thought about another operation, another girl, another moment when he had chosen to follow protocol instead of instinct. Celine had been her name, and she had been an asset too, and she had died because he had made the tactically correct decision that turned out to be the morally catastrophic one. Not this time. Not with this woman who was looking at him with eyes that held 5 years of survival and still found the strength to be defiant. Not with his mate, even if she did not know that was what she was yet. The decision felt inevitable even as he made it. Marcus is correct that this is not our operation by the traditional definition. But extraction protocols exist for a reason, and those protocols do not differentiate between our assets and assets belonging to other organizations. The operative sent a distress signal. The operative is in enemy territory with a compromised cover. The operative is facing immediate threat of capture or death. Under those circumstances, standing rules of engagement require us to provide assistance regardless of command structure. He took one measured step forward, watching the way Logartha's grip on her blade tightened in response, and he let his voice drop into the register he used for promises that he intended to keep. We do not leave operators behind, even if they are not ours, even if the extraction was meant for someone else. You sent a signal asking for help, and we are the ones who answered. That makes you our responsibility until you are safely off this mountain and back in contact with your actual command. What he did not say, what he could not say in front of his team and in the middle of an active operation, was that she was his, and no force in the universe was going to take her away from him now that he had found her. The mate bond was pulling at him with a strength that was almost painful, demanding that he close the distance between them, that he mark her as his own, that he eliminate every threat to her safety with the kind of violence that would probably horrify her. But he was a king, not an animal, and he would prove to her through actions rather than words that he could be trusted to protect without dominating, to claim without caging. Logartha stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something he could not name. Then, slowly, she lowered the improvised blade and held out her wrists, the silver manacles catching the lantern light and throwing it back in harsh reflections. Then I suggest you work quickly, because Harkin will have heard that explosion, and he has a response time of approximately 3 minutes when he believes his property is being threatened. The word property made Leonidus's wolf bare its teeth, but he controlled the reaction before it could show on his face. She was not property. She would never be property. She was his mate, and if this Harkin had laid hands on her with the intention of claiming ownership, Leonidus would make certain the man understood exactly what that mistake was going to cost him. Cale moved forward immediately, his lockpick set already in hand, and Leonidus watched as the medic went to work on the manacles with practiced efficiency. The moment the first lock released and the silver band fell away from Logartha's wrist, Leonidus caught the full force of her scent, no longer filtered through metal and chemical suppression. It hit him like a physical blow, star jasmine and wildfire concentrated enough to make his vision narrow and his breathing stop. His wolf surged forward with a demand that was absolute and undeniable, but he held it back through sheer force of will that left him shaking with the effort. The second manacle opened, and Logartha's entire body seemed to sag, as if the removal of the silver had taken away the framework that had been holding her upright. Kael caught her before she could fall, his hands gentle on her shoulders, and Leonidus saw the way the medic's expression tightened as he got his first clear look at the damage the silver had done. The burns went deeper than the skin, down into the muscle and possibly into the bone itself, and there was a grayish cast to her flesh that suggested systemic poisoning rather than simple contact wounds. Leonidus was moving before conscious thought registered the decision, crossing the small space to stand beside Cale and look down at Logartha with an intensity that probably revealed more than was tactically wise. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she was holding herself together through determination alone. She was magnificent and broken in equal measure, and his wolf wanted nothing more than to gather her up and take her somewhere safe, where time and care could heal what this place had done to her. "How long since your last dose of wolfsbane?" Kael's question was clinical, and Logartha answered with the same professional detachment, even though Leonidus could see the way consciousness was starting to slip away from her. 18 hours. I stopped taking it when I sent the extraction signal because I knew I would need access to my wolf if things went wrong. But the silver has been keeping the withdrawal symptoms manageable. 18 hours, which meant she had been in active withdrawal, dealing with the physical agony of her wolf trying to wake up after 5 years of forced dormancy while chained in silver and waiting for rescue that might never come. The courage that required, the sheer stubborn refusal to break under conditions that would have destroyed most people, only confirmed what his wolf already knew. She was worthy of him. She was strong enough to stand beside a lichen king and not be diminished by the comparison. Kale made a sound that was somewhere between a curse and a prayer, then began pulling supplies from his pack with quick, efficient movements. Leonidus knew what that meant, knew that the medic was preparing for a medical emergency rather than a simple field dressing, and he felt the operation timeline compress in his mind. They had been on site for 7 minutes. The explosion had occurred at the 5-minute mark. If Harkin's response time estimate was accurate, they had less than 1 minute before contact. He turned to Royce, forcing himself to focus on tactics rather than the overwhelming need to touch Logartha, to confirm through physical contact that she was real and safe. "Assessment, can we move her?" Royce stepped forward, his eyes moving over Logartha with analytical precision, and his conclusion was immediate and unforgiving. "Number. Not without a stretcher or a fireman carry, and either option will slow us down enough that we will not reach the extraction point before we are engaged. We need to hold this position and wait for the situation upstairs to stabilize, or we need to find an alternate route that does not require climbing stairs under hostile conditions." Leonidus's tactical mind was already working through possibilities, but his wolf was focused on something else entirely. If they could not move Logartha safely, then he would carry her. The idea of anyone else touching her, even his own men for the purpose of evacuation, made his skin crawl with possessive fury that he knew was irrational but could not suppress. Darius spoke up from his position near the door, his voice tight but controlled. "Sir, I can hear movement on the level above us. Multiple contacts moving fast. They know we are here, and they are preparing to come down." The tactical situation crystallized with the clarity that came from too many years of making impossible decisions. But underneath the analysis, his wolf was making different calculations. Logartha was his mate. She was injured and vulnerable, and he would die before he let anyone take her from him. Protocol and political consequences be damned. He moved to the wall where Logartha had hung her surveillance photos and her maps, forcing himself to focus on the practical problem rather than the howling need to claim and protect. The maps showed a drainage system that ran beneath the facility, old pipes that might be wide enough for evacuation if they were willing to accept extreme discomfort. The nearest access point was marked with a small red circle, and Leonidus made his decision. "We extract through this drainage system. Kale goes first to clear the route. I carry Logartha. Marcus provides rear security. Royce and Darius handle any pursuit." The pronouncement was not phrased as a question or a suggestion, and his tone made it clear that debate was not welcome. He was claiming responsibility for Logartha's safety because she was his to protect, and if his team found that unusual, they had the wisdom not to comment on it. Marcus was already setting charges to create a diversion, his movements economical and practiced. Logartha watched the preparations through eyes that were starting to glaze with exhaustion and shock. But when Leonidus crouched beside her to explain what was going to happen next, she focused on him with an intensity that suggested her mind was still sharp, even if her body was failing. "I am going to carry you through the drainage pipes. It will not be comfortable, and I apologize for that, but it is the only way to get you out of here safely. I need you to trust me." The request was more personal than tactical, asking for something that had nothing to do with the operation and everything to do with the connection forming between them. Logartha studied his face for a moment that stretched too long, and then she nodded once. "I have survived worse. Do what you need to do." Leonidus did not allow himself to think about the implications of touching her, about what skin-to-skin contact was going to do to his already fraying control. He simply slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees, lifting her with a care that bordered on reverence. Her weight was negligible, proof of how much the years of poisoning had cost her, and the way she fit against his chest felt so perfectly right that his wolf settled for the first time since entering the compound. The moment his skin made contact with hers, even through the layers of clothing, the mate bond flared with an intensity that nearly brought him to his knees. It was not the gentle recognition of compatible souls. It was acclaiming on a cellular level, his lichen blood recognizing what it had been waiting for and refusing to let go. Logartha made a small sound that might have been surprise or pain, and Leonidus realized she could feel it too, the pull between them that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with biology demanding its due. Later. They would deal with it later, after she was safe and healed and capable of making informed decisions about what this connection meant. For now, he simply held her and moved toward the drainage access point that Kael had already opened. The crawl through the drainage system was every bit as miserable as predicted, but Leonidus barely registered the discomfort. All his focus was on the woman in his arms, on keeping her stable and protected while navigating the tight confines of the concrete pipe. She had gone quiet, her breathing shallow but steady, and he could feel the heat of withdrawal fever burning through her clothes. His wolf was content in a way it had never been before, satisfied by the simple fact of holding their mate close enough to shield her from all threats. The possessiveness should have worried him, the intensity of what he was feeling after knowing her for less than an hour. But instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She was his, he was hers, and everything else was just logistics that would work themselves out once he got her somewhere safe. The drainage pipe emptied into a culvert near the tree line, and Leonidus emerged into the cool mountain air, still carrying Logartha against his chest. The extraction helicopter was already inbound, the sound of rotors cutting through the night, and his team secured the perimeter with practiced efficiency. He did not release her even when Kael tried to take her for medical assessment in the helicopter. Instead, he carried her into the cargo bay himself and sat with her cradled in his lap while the medic worked around them both. His arms stayed locked around her, even when consciousness finally deserted her completely, her body surrendering to exhaustion and shock now that immediate danger had passed. Marcus looked at him once with an expression that held questions and understanding in equal measure, but the weapons master said nothing. There would be time later for explanations and discussions about protocol violations and the political implications of what Leonidus was claiming. For now, his team simply accepted that their king had found something worth protecting with a ferocity that went beyond tactical considerations, and they adjusted their operations accordingly. The flight back to the Citadel took 30 minutes, and Leonidas spent every second of it cataloging the woman in his arms, the way her breathing evened out once the immediate stress was removed, the way her scent, even masked by wolfsbane residue, made his wolf settle into protective stillness, the way her hand had unconsciously curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding on even in unconsciousness. By the time they landed, he had accepted what his wolf had known from the moment he saw her. Logartha was not just another extraction, not just another asset to protect and release once the mission was complete. She was his mate, the one the universe had decided belonged beside him, and he would move mountains to ensure she survived long enough to decide whether she wanted to accept that bond or walk away from it. Either way, she would make the choice freely, but he would be damned if he let anything happen to her before she had the chance to choose. They carried her directly to the medical wing, and this time Leonidus did release her, but only because Kael and the Citadel's senior physician needed space to work. He stood outside the treatment room for hours, refusing to leave, even when Marcus suggested rest would be more productive than pacing worn stone floors. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Leonidus was still there, still waiting, still holding vigil over a woman who had walked into his life through a breach charge and smoke, and who had somehow become the center of his universe in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His wolf was patient now, content to wait because it knew with absolute certainty that she was worth waiting for. And if patience was what it took to prove he could be the mate she deserved, rather than just another threat to survive, then he would wait as long as necessary. The story was only beginning, but some beginnings felt like they had been written in the stars long before the first words were spoken. This was one of those beginnings, and Leonidus intended to see it through to whatever end awaited them both. Consciousness returned to Logartha in fragments, but the first thing she registered was not pain or the absence of it. It was a presence, something that pulled at her awareness even before she opened her eyes, a warmth that felt both foreign and fundamentally right. Her wolf, dormant for so long it had become little more than a whisper, was suddenly awake and alert in a way it had not been in 5 years. not distressed or agitated, but focused with an intensity that made her chest tighten with something she could not immediately name. She knew he was there before she saw him, the Lycan King who had carried her through drainage pipes and refused to let anyone else touch her during the extraction. She could feel his presence like a physical weight in the room, as if the air itself was different when he occupied a space. Her skin felt sensitized, aware of his location, with a precision that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instincts that the wolfsbane should have suppressed completely. When she finally opened her eyes, carefully testing the movement before committing to it, she found herself staring at a ceiling made of smooth stone that had been carved with intricate patterns. The work was old, centuries old if she was any judge, and it spoke of a time when people had cared about beauty even in purely functional spaces. The medical wing of the Citadel, then. She had studied this place during her Shadow Council training, but the intelligence reports had not mentioned the craftsmanship or the way the morning light came through high windows and turned everything to gold. A chair scraped against the floor to her left, and she turned her head with more effort than the movement should have required. But it was not the king. It was an older man, probably in his 60s in human terms, with silver hair pulled back in a neat tail and eyes that had seen enough death to be comfortable in its presence. He wore the simple robes of a physician, but there was a military bearing in the way he held himself that suggested he had not always spent his days in treatment rooms. The physician noticed her attention and leaned forward slightly, his voice pitched to carry without being loud enough to startle. "You have been unconscious for 36 hours. Your body needed time to process the trauma and begin the healing process. I am Master Goss, senior physician of the Lycan Citadel, and you are currently under my care. Before you ask, yes, the extraction was successful. All members of the team returned safely. And no, you are not a prisoner, although I suspect you will have several pointed conversations with people who would very much like to understand what exactly they extracted from that compound." Logartha processed the information with the same methodical approach she had trained herself to use during her undercover work. But underneath the analysis, her wolf was still searching for something. Someone. The awareness of his absence was almost painful, a hollow ache that made no sense given that she had known him for less than an hour before consciousness had deserted her. She tried to speak and found her throat was too dry to produce anything more than a rasp. Goss was ready with a cup of water, holding it steady while she sipped carefully through a straw. The water was cold and clean and tasted like nothing, which somehow made it the most luxurious thing she had experienced in recent memory. "Thank you. I need to contact my handler. There are protocols that need to be followed, reports that need to be filed. The intelligence I gathered is time-sensitive, and every hour of delay increases the risk that the trafficking routes will shift before we can act on the information." The physician settled back into his chair with the patient expression of a man who had heard similar urgencies before and learned to evaluate them against medical reality. "Your handler can wait until you are strong enough to sit upright without assistance. The intelligence can wait until your internal organs are functioning at levels that will not result in catastrophic failure if you attempt to stand. The protocols, I suspect, were written by people who have never personally experienced systemic silver poisoning, combined with 5 years of continuous wolfsbane ingestion, and they can therefore be safely ignored until such time as you are not actively dying." The bluntness of the assessment cut through the professional detachment Logartha had been trying to maintain. She had spent so long being useful, being functional, being the asset that provided value, that the idea of simply existing without purpose felt dangerously close to surrender. Goss must have seen something in her expression, because his voice softened fractionally. "The Lycan King has asked to speak with you when you are recovered enough for conversation. He has questions, many questions, and I suspect some of them will be difficult to answer. But he has also made it clear that you are under his personal protection until such time as you choose to leave, and that anyone who attempts to coerce or threaten you will answer to him directly." The physician paused, and his eyes held something that might have been curiosity or might have been knowing amusement. "I have been serving this citadel for 40 years, and I have never seen our king behave the way he did during your extraction. He carried you himself when protocol dictates that medics handle injured assets. He refused to release you to my care until I physically assured him that maintaining contact was interfering with treatment, and he has been standing guard outside this room for most of the past 36 hours, which is behavior I would expect from a mate rather than a commanding officer who happened to extract a foreign operative. The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that made Logartha's pulse accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with medical distress. Mate. The word echoed in her mind with a resonance that her wolf recognized, even if her human consciousness wanted to reject it as impossible. She had been suppressing her nature for 5 years, had poisoned herself so thoroughly that her scent should have been completely masked, and yet somehow the Lycan King had recognized something in her that she had been trying to hide from the entire world. Before she could formulate a response, the door to the treatment room opened, and a woman entered carrying a tray of food that smelled like it had been prepared for someone recovering from extended malnutrition. The woman was perhaps 50 in human terms, with the kind of competent efficiency that came from decades of practice, and she set the tray on the side table without ceremony before turning to leave. But she paused at the door, looking back with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and assessment. Most of the girls they bring back from situations like yours do not survive the first week. The ones who do survive usually do not want to speak of what happened to them. But you are not like the others, I think. You have the eyes of someone who chose their path rather than being forced onto it. That makes you either very brave or very foolish, and I cannot yet tell which. Then she was gone, and Logartha was left alone with Goss and a tray of food that she was not certain her stomach could handle. But the physician was watching her with an expectation that was difficult to ignore, so she forced herself to take a spoonful of the broth and discovered that her body was far more interested in sustenance than her mind had been willing to acknowledge. She ate slowly, methodically, while Goss made notations on a chart that probably documented every aspect of her physical condition in exhaustive detail. When she had managed about half the bowl, he seemed satisfied and took the tray away, replacing it with a glass of something that looked like cloudy water, but smelled faintly medicinal. This will help your body process the remaining wolfsbane in your system. It tastes unpleasant, but not as unpleasant as what you have been ingesting for the past 5 years, so I trust you will manage. Drink it slowly, and if you experience any dizziness or nausea, inform me immediately. Logartha drank the mixture as instructed and found that the physician had understated the matter considerably. But she had drunk worse things for longer periods, and she finished the glass without complaint before settling back against the pillows with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. She must have dozed again, because when she opened her eyes the light had shifted and there was a different presence in the room. The awareness hit her before vision focused, a pull so strong it was almost physical, and her wolf surged forward with an intensity that actually hurt. Leonidus sat in the chair that Goss had occupied earlier, his large frame somehow fitting into the space without seeming cramped. He was not wearing tactical gear anymore. Instead, he had changed into simple dark clothing that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the silver that threaded through his hair at the temples. He was reading something on a data tablet, his expression focused, but the moment her breathing pattern changed, he looked up, and their eyes met with an impact that made the air between them feel charged. For several heartbeats, neither of them spoke, and Logartha felt the mate bond pulling at her with a strength that was impossible to ignore now that she was conscious enough to recognize it. This was what Goss had been hinting at, this connection that had formed between them without permission or conscious choice, binding them together with threads she could feel but not see. Leonidus set the tablet aside with a deliberate movement and leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she remembered, as if the past 36 hours had cost him something. "How are you feeling? And before you default to the professional assessment you were trained to give, I am asking as someone who carried you through a drainage pipe and felt every tremor that went through your body during withdrawal. I know you are not fine. I would like to know how not fine you actually are." The directness caught her off guard, cutting through the layers of defensive protocol she had been preparing. She found herself responding with more honesty than was tactically wise. "I feel like I have been turned inside out. My wolf is awake for the first time in 5 years, and she is not being quiet about the fact that she has opinions on our current situation. My body hurts in places I did not know could hurt. And there is something pulling at me that I do not understand, something that started the moment you touched me during the extraction and has not stopped since. She paused, watching his face for a reaction, and saw the way his jaw tightened fractionally. You feel it too, the connection. That is why you carried me yourself, why you would not let anyone else touch me, why Goss said you have been standing guard outside this room like a mate instead of a commanding officer. Leonidas held her gaze without flinching, and when he spoke, there was no attempt to deny or diminish what she had identified. Yes, I felt the mate bond the moment I saw you. My wolf recognized you before my mind could process what was happening, and the pull has been getting stronger rather than weaker as time passes. But I want you to understand something important. I did not extract you because of the bond. I extracted you because you sent a distress signal and you were in danger. The bond changes how I feel about your safety, but it does not change the fact that you have autonomy and choice in this situation. He stood, moving to the window with movements that suggested he needed the physical distance to maintain control, and Logartha saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself. I have lived for 137 years. I have watched other people find their mates and build lives together, and I stopped believing it would happen for me sometime around the century mark. And now the universe decides to present me with a mate who has spent 5 years poisoning herself to avoid detection, who is a trained operative with loyalties to an organization I do not control, and who has every reason to be suspicious of powerful males making claims on her autonomy. He turned back to face her, and the expression on his face was complex, layered with things she could not fully parse. So here is what I am offering: time, space. The opportunity to heal and recover and figure out what you want without pressure or expectation. The mate bond exists whether we want it to or not, but that does not mean you are obligated to accept it or act on it. You can walk away once you are strong enough, and I will not stop you. But while you are here, you are under my protection, and anyone who tries to hurt you or use you will have to go through me first. The words should have felt like a threat or a cage, but instead they felt like the first genuine freedom Logartha had experienced in 5 years. He was giving her choice, acknowledging the bond while refusing to use it as a weapon or a chain. Her wolf was purring with satisfaction at his words, recognizing the offer for what it was: a courtship rather than a claiming, partnership rather than possession. I can feel it, she said quietly. The pull. It is like gravity, and you are the center of mass. My wolf wants me to close the distance between us, to confirm through touch what she already knows. But my human mind is screaming that this is too fast, too intense, too dangerous to trust after 5 years of trusting no one. Leonidas nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. Then we listen to your human mind while we give your wolf time to adjust. The bond is not going anywhere. It will wait until you are ready to explore what it means, or until you decide that you want nothing to do with it. Either way, the choice is yours to make. Before Logartha could respond, there was a knock at the door, and Kael entered carrying a medical kit and wearing an expression that suggested this was a scheduled check rather than an emergency. The medic's eyes moved between Logartha and Leonidas with the assessment of someone who missed very little, but his voice when he spoke was purely professional. Sir, I need to examine the patient and change her dressings, if you would prefer to wait outside. Leonidas moved toward the door immediately, but he paused beside Logartha's bed, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before he pulled it back, respecting the distance she needed. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. I will be right outside if you need anything, and when you are strong enough, we need to discuss what you discovered about the Shadow Council. But that conversation can wait until you are ready for it. Then he was gone, and Logartha felt his absence like a physical ache, the bond stretching thin but not breaking. Kael watched the door close before turning to her with an expression that was far too knowing. He has been impossible to deal with for the past 36 hours, snapping at people who have worked with him for decades, pacing the corridors, refusing to rest because he needs to be close enough to respond if you show any signs of distress. I have seen mate bonds form before, but never with someone who has spent a century convincing himself he was meant to be alone. The medic began his examination with practiced efficiency, checking the burns on her wrists and the color of her skin and the responsiveness of her reflexes. His touch was clinical but gentle, and Logartha found herself relaxing fractionally under the familiar routine of medical assessment. Cale continued talking while he worked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had decided she needed information, whether she asked for it or not. Or, "You should know that he spent most of the extraction holding you like you were made of glass and fury in equal measure. I have served under Leonidas for 20 years, and I have never seen him lose his tactical composure the way he did when you were in danger. The moment your cover story mentioned Beta Harkin, his entire demeanor shifted. I thought he was going to tear the compound apart with his bare hands." Logartha absorbed this information, filing it away with everything else she was learning about the man whose life had apparently become entangled with hers through biology and fate. Over the next 3 days, Logartha progressed from bedbound to mobile, her body responding to treatment with a resilience that surprised even Goss. But the mate bond remained a constant presence, a pull that intensified whenever Leonidus was nearby and never quite disappeared, even when he maintained the distance she had requested. She caught glimpses of him in the corridors, always close enough to respond to emergencies, but far enough to give her space, and each time their eyes met, she felt the connection flare with an intensity that left her breathless. By the 4th day, she was well enough to be escorted to the war room for her first formal debriefing, and that was when she met the Sentinels properly for the first time. The war room was exactly what she would have expected from a military command center, functional and focused, with maps covering the walls and tactical displays embedded in the main table. 4 men stood around the table when she entered with Leonidus, and she recognized them immediately from the extraction. But what struck her now, in the light and without the immediacy of danger, was how they positioned themselves. Not as subordinates behind their king, but as equals around a table, comfortable enough with each other to show genuine familiarity. Leonidus made the introductions with brisk efficiency, and Logartha catalogued each man with the trained observation that had kept her alive for 5 years. Marcus, the weapons master, had steady eyes that assessed her without judgment. Cale offered a brief smile that acknowledged their previous conversations. Roy studied her with the calculating precision of someone determining whether she was an asset or a liability. Darius gave her a small wave that was almost apologetic, and she saw the tremor in his fingers that he was trying to hide. As Leonidas gestured for everyone to sit, Logartha felt his presence beside her with an awareness that went beyond normal spatial recognition. When he moved, she knew it before looking. When he shifted his weight, her body wanted to mirror the movement. The mate bond was making itself known in 1,000 small ways, and maintaining professional composure was requiring more effort than she wanted to admit. The briefing began, and Logartha walked them through her cover assignment with the precision of someone who had been trained to remember everything. But she was also hyper-aware of Leonidas beside her, the way he leaned forward when she described particularly dangerous situations, the way his hands clenched when she mentioned Harkin's suspicions. She could feel his wolf responding to her distress even when her voice remained steady, could sense the way he was fighting the urge to reach for her every time she described something that had threatened her safety. After 2 hours of detailed questioning, the Sentinels were exchanging looks that suggested they had reached conclusions she was not yet privy to. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The intelligence she has provided is actionable, but it also confirms what we suspected about the Shadow Council. They are not investigating the networks. They are mapping them for future acquisition." The discussion continued, each sentinel adding their analysis, and then Leonidas reached for a data tablet and turned it so she could see the screen. The moment his fingers brushed against hers in passing the device, the mate bond flared with an intensity that made her catch her breath. She saw him freeze, saw the way his pupils dilated and his breathing changed, and knew he had felt it too. The document on the screen was an encrypted Shadow Council memo, but Logartha barely processed the words because she was too focused on the point of contact where their hands had touched. Her skin felt electrified, every nerve ending focused on that small area of connection, and her wolf was demanding she lean into the touch rather than pull away from it. Leonidas withdrew his hand with visible effort, his voice rougher when he spoke. This memo outlines their strategic decision to allow trafficking networks to continue operating under observation rather than dismantling them. You were not gathering intelligence to save people. You were mapping the networks so the council could take them over. Logartha forced herself to focus on the document, to read through the bureaucratic language and understand what it meant. The betrayal hit her with physical force, and she felt the nausea rising even before her conscious mind had fully processed the implications. 5 years of poisoning herself, 5 years of documenting horrors and believing it mattered, and it had all been in service of making the traffickers more efficient. The nausea won, and she barely had time to turn her head before her stomach emptied itself. Leonidus was moving immediately, his hand steady on her shoulder as he held her hair back with the other, and somewhere in the humiliation of the moment she registered that a king was helping her through what should have been a private moment of weakness. When the spasms finally subsided, Goss was there with a cloth and a basin, cleaning her up with professional efficiency. But it was Leonidus's hand that remained on her shoulder, grounding her, and his touch was the only thing keeping her from flying apart as the full scope of what she had been complicit in crashed over her. The sentinels had quietly left the room at some point, giving them privacy, and Logartha found herself sitting in a chair with Leonidus crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers, and his expression holding something that looked like controlled fury. "You were 16 years old when they recruited you. You were driven by trauma and grief and a need to matter. They took advantage of that, weaponized it, turned you into exactly the kind of asset they needed. That is on them, not on you." His hand moved from her shoulder to cup her face, the touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes, and Logartha felt the mate bond singing at the contact. But what happens next is your choice to make. You can go back to them, file your reports, pretend this conversation never happened. Or you can stay here and help us actually stop what the Shadow Council is doing. I cannot promise you safety if you choose that path. I can only promise that you will not face it alone. Logartha looked at him, at the fierce protectiveness in his expression, and the way he was touching her like she was precious despite having known her for only days. She thought about her mother, about the girls in her reports, about 5 years of sacrifice that had meant nothing. The decision was easier than it should have been. I choose to stay. But I need you to understand something. I do not trust easily anymore, and I will not be anyone's asset ever again. If I share what I know, it is because I choose to, not because you command it or expect it. And if at any point I feel like I am being used the way the Shadow Council used me, I will walk away and you will not try to stop me. Leonidus studied her for a long moment, his thumb moving unconsciously against her cheek in a caress that made her wolf practically purr. Those terms are acceptable, and I give you my word that I will never use the mate bond as leverage or obligation. What is between us exists separately from any tactical alliance we form. You can have one without the other, if that is what you choose. The promise settled something in Logartha's chest, and before she could second-guess the impulse, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. The gesture was intimate without being sexual, a recognition of connection that her wolf demanded, and her human mind could accept. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, and Logartha felt the mate bond settle into something that was still intense but no longer overwhelming. When they finally pulled apart, Leonidus's eyes held heat that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the attraction he was clearly working to control. The sentinels returned after a discreet interval, and the tactical planning resumed. But something had shifted, some barrier had come down, and when the discussion turned to the high summit strategy, Logartha found herself offering suggestions rather than just providing information. The team accepted her input without question, treating her as a partner rather than an asset, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she was part of something that might actually matter. As the meeting concluded and the sentinels prepared to depart for their assigned tasks, Marcus lingered behind. The weapons master approached Leonidus with the ease of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. "Sir, I need to mention something about operational security. If the mate bond is affecting your tactical judgment, we need to acknowledge that and build compensations into our planning." Leonidus met his oldest friend's eyes without flinching. "The mate bond makes me want to lock her in the most secure room in this citadel and never let her face danger again. But she is a trained operative who has survived 5 years of deep cover in conditions that would have broken most people. My judgment is to trust her competence while providing the backup she has earned the right to request. Does that address your concern?" Marcus studied them both for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. And for what it is worth, I think she is good for you. I have not seen you this engaged with anything beyond tactical necessities in decades." When they were finally alone in the war room, Logartha and Leonidas stood on opposite sides of the table, the physical distance necessary because the pull between them was strong enough that maintaining it required conscious effort. Leonidas spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of decisions he had made and regretted. "I need to tell you about Celine. You deserve to know why I react the way I do when assets are in danger, and why your safety matters to me beyond the mate bond." He told her about the operation 80 years ago, about the choice he had made to prioritize strategic objectives over one person's safety, about the 3 months Celine had spent in captivity before dying. His voice remained steady throughout, but Logartha could see the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, could sense the old wound that had never properly healed. When he finished, she moved around the table without consciously deciding to do so, driven by an impulse that was part mate bond and part simple human compassion. She stopped close enough to touch, but did not close the final distance, giving him the same choice he had given her. "I am not her. I am not asking you to choose between me and the mission. But I am asking you to trust that I can make my own choices about acceptable risk." Leonidas looked at her with eyes that held a century of loneliness and the beginning of hope that maybe this time could be different. "I will try. And I promise you this, on my word and my throne and everything I have built. I will not fail you the way I failed her. Whatever comes, whatever the cost, you will not die alone and forgotten because I chose strategy over humanity. That is my oath to you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with intention and consequence. Logartha closed the final distance and took his hand, feeling the mate bond flare at the contact, but no longer afraid of its intensity. "Then I give you my oath in return. I will not ask you to compromise your principles or your duty, but I will ask you to let me stand beside you as an equal partner, not as someone who needs constant protection. Can you accept that?" Leonidas's fingers closed around hers, his grip firm but careful, and when he spoke, his voice held the certainty of a vow. "Yes. And I will spend however long it takes to prove that I can be the mate you deserve, not just another person trying to control you for my own purposes." Logartha felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of her understanding. This was not just an alliance of convenience or a transaction dictated by biology. This was the beginning of something that could be real if they were both brave enough to choose it, mate bond or no mate bond. She did not know what to do with that realization, so she simply held his hand and let the silence stretch between them, comfortable now rather than tense, until the golden light of sunset began to paint the war room walls, and they both understood that the real work was only just beginning. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to stand together and acknowledge what was growing between them. The strategic planning could wait. The Shadow Council could wait. Everything else could wait until they had taken the time to understand what it meant to be mates who chose partnership over possession, allies who respected each other's strength rather than trying to diminish it. And if that choice led them into danger, at least they would face it together, which was more than either of them had expected to find when fate had decided to intervene in their carefully constructed solitary lives. The next morning brought Logartha's first full briefing with the Sentinels as an acknowledged partner. She entered the war room to find them already assembled, and when Leonidas gestured to a chair beside him rather than across the table, the shift in status was clear. The mate bond hummed with approval at the proximity, his scent surrounding her with notes of ozone and cedar that made maintaining professional composure difficult. Marcus began the briefing by laying out what they knew about the Shadow Council's current operations. As he spoke, Logartha added details the Sentinel's intelligence had missed, filling gaps from her 5 years of observation. The information flowed naturally, her training and their expertise complementing each other. Royce interrupted with a blunt question that suggested he had stopped viewing her as someone who needed careful handling. "You said Harkin operates independently of the main network. Does that mean he has his own supply chain, or is he pulling from the same sources and just handling distribution differently?" Logartha appreciated the tactical question, the assumption she would know operational details. "Both. He has cultivated relationships with smaller packs the main network considers too unstable or remote to bother with. But he also intercepts shipments when opportunity presents itself, which makes him both competitor and parasite. The main network tolerates him because eliminating him would draw unwanted attention." The discussion continued for another hour, each sentinel contributing their expertise, while Logartha provided context that transformed intelligence into strategy. She relaxed into professional collaboration, the familiar comfort of working with people who valued competence. It was Darius who brought up what they had been avoiding. If we are going to move against the Shadow Council at the High Summit, we need to understand the personal dynamics at play. The mate bond between you two is going to be obvious to anyone with functional senses the moment you are in the same room together. We need to decide whether we use that as part of the strategy or whether we try to hide it. The directness of the statement made Logartha's breath catch, but Leonidus responded with the same tactical pragmatism he brought to all strategic discussions. We use it. Attempting to hide a mate bond only works if you have months of practice suppressing the biological signals, and we have days at most. Better to acknowledge it and build the strategy around the assumption that everyone will know. Marcus nodded agreement. It could work in our favor. The Shadow Council treats you as a lone operator. Revealing you have found your mate changes the calculus. It makes you appear more stable, more invested in long-term planning. He paused, then added carefully. It also makes them believe they have leverage. They will assume they can threaten her to control you, which means they will reveal their hand by attempting to do exactly that. We can prepare for those attempts and turn them against the Council. Logartha felt something cold settle in her stomach at the implication that she would be used as bait. But before she could voice the objection, Leonidus spoke with an edge in his voice that suggested his wolf was very close to the surface. Any strategy that relies on Logartha being placed in deliberate danger is not acceptable. We find another approach. The possessiveness in his tone should have irritated her, should have triggered all her defensive instincts about males trying to control her choices, but instead she found herself oddly touched by the vehemence of his protection. He was not trying to exclude her from risk because he thought her weak. He was reacting to the mate bond's demand that he keep her safe, and he was being honest about that limitation rather than pretending it did not exist. She placed her hand over his where it rested on the table, feeling the mate bond flare at the contact, but using the touch to ground them both. I appreciate the protective instinct, but Marcus has a point. If we are going to expose the Shadow Council, they need to reveal their methods, and the fastest way to make them do that is to give them a target they believe they can exploit. I am not suggesting we make it easy for them, but we cannot eliminate all risk just because you and I happen to be biologically connected. Leonidus looked at her with eyes that held a century of command, struggling against instincts that were far older than tactics or strategy. His hand turned under hers, their fingers interlacing in a gesture that was both intimate and possessive. I understand the logic, but I need you to understand that if something happens to you because we deliberately put you in danger, it will destroy me in ways that have nothing to do with tactical failure and everything to do with losing the one person the universe decided I was meant to protect. The raw honesty in his voice made Logartha's chest tighten, and she saw the sentinels exchanging glances that suggested this level of emotional vulnerability from their king was unprecedented. Then we make sure nothing happens to me. We plan for every contingency, we position backup at every possible intervention point, and we make certain that the Shadow Council's attempts to exploit the mate bond become the very thing that exposes them. But we do not let fear of what might happen prevent us from doing what needs to be done. Kale cleared his throat, breaking the intensity of the moment with characteristic pragmatism. If we are going to use the mate bond as part of the strategy, we need to understand what biological signals we are working with. The scent changes, the behavioral cues, the way unmated males will react to a claimed Luna. I can run assessments to determine what suppressants might be necessary if we need to dampen the signals at specific times. Logartha felt herself blushing at the clinical discussion of her biology, but she appreciated Kael's straightforward approach. This was tactical planning, not personal judgment, and treating it as such made the conversation manageable. The wolfsbane is almost completely out of my system now, which means my natural scent is returning. I have been told it is distinctive, but I have been suppressing it for so long that I do not actually know what unmated males experience when exposed to a Luna pheromone signature. Royce interjected with the practical concern of a quartermaster who had seen too many operations fail due to unconsidered details. We need to test that before the summit. Controlled exposure in a secure environment so we know what we are working with. The last thing we need is to trigger a feeding frenzy because we underestimated the biological response. Leonidus's grip on Logartha's hand tightened fractionally. his wolf clearly unhappy with the idea of other males being exposed to her scent, even in controlled conditions. But his voice when he spoke was steady, professional discipline, overriding instinctive possessiveness. Agreed. We conduct the test tomorrow. Limited exposure, medical monitoring, and I want at least 3 different alpha ranks represented so we have a full spectrum of reactions. Royce, you coordinate the volunteers. Make certain they understand this is a tactical assessment, not an opportunity. The warning in his tone was unmistakable, and Royce nodded with the faint smile of someone who had expected exactly that response. The briefing continued for another hour, covering logistics and communication protocols and contingency planning with the kind of exhaustive detail that Logartha recognized as the hallmark of professional military operations. By the time they concluded, she had a comprehensive understanding of what the next 3 weeks would entail and a growing respect for the Sentinels who had apparently been running these kinds of complex operations for decades. As the others filed out, Leonidus remained beside her, their hands still interlaced. When alone, he spoke quietly. I know I am being overprotective. I know it probably makes you want to prove your independence by taking unnecessary risks just to establish that I do not control you. But I need you to understand where it is coming from. For over a century, I have had nothing to lose beyond tactical assets and political alliances. Now I have you, and the idea of losing you terrifies me in ways I did not know I was still capable of feeling. Logartha turned to face him fully, using her free hand to cup his jaw in a mirror of how he had touched her the previous day. I do understand, and I am not going to take unnecessary risks just to prove a point. But I am also not going to let the mate bond turn me into someone who needs constant protection. We need to find a balance between your instinct to keep me safe and my need to remain a functional operator. Can we agree to work toward that balance? Leonidus leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the contact. Yes, and I promise to try to control the possessive impulses, even when my wolf is demanding I lock you in a tower and eliminate anyone who looks at you the wrong way. The image was absurd enough that Logartha found herself laughing, the sound surprising them both. I would probably escape from your tower within the first hour, just so you know. I have 5 years of experience getting out of locked rooms. When Leonidus opened his eyes, they held warmth that had nothing to do with the mate bond and everything to do with genuine affection. I have no doubt, which is why I am choosing partnership instead. Much harder to escape from something you actually want to be part of. They sat for several minutes more, hands interlaced and defenses lowered, letting the bond settle into something that felt less like biological imperative and more like genuine connection. The tactical planning could resume later. The summit preparation would continue tomorrow. But for now, in the quiet war room with afternoon light painting the maps gold, it was enough to simply be present and acknowledge that what was growing between them was worth protecting. When they finally stood to leave, Logartha felt the bond stretch as distance increased, but it was manageable now, no longer overwhelming. They were learning to exist in the same space without constant contact, learning to trust that the connection would hold. As they walked through the Citadel corridors, Logartha noticed how people looked at them. Not with surprise, but with satisfaction, as if the entire Citadel had been waiting for their king to find someone. She was beginning to understand that her presence here was changing more than tactics. She was changing how Leonidus interacted with his people, softening edges that had been sharp too long and opening possibilities decades of solitary rule had closed. And if that responsibility felt heavy, it also felt important in ways that her Shadow Council work never had. This was not about gathering intelligence or maintaining cover. This was about building something real with someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a useful tool. She could work with that. In fact, she was beginning to think she might want to. The planning consumed 21 days of intensive preparation, and Logartha discovered that living in close proximity to a mate bond was an education in restraint she had never anticipated needing. Every strategic meeting became an exercise in maintaining professional focus when Leonidus sat close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Every tactical discussion was underscored by an awareness of him that went beyond normal spatial recognition, her wolf tracking his movements with a precision that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with biology demanding its due. The controlled scent exposure test had been conducted on day 3, and the results had been both illuminating and problematic. 6 unmated alphas of varying ranks had been brought into a sealed room where Logartha sat behind one-way glass, her natural pheromones no longer suppressed by wolfsbane. The reactions had been immediate and universal. Within 30 seconds, all 6 men showed signs of biological interest ranging from dilated pupils to barely controlled aggression toward each other as they competed for attention from a Luna they could smell but not see. Leonidus had watched from the observation deck with a stillness that Logartha recognized as his wolf fighting for dominance, his hands gripping the railing hard enough that the metal groaned under the pressure. When one of the younger alphas had actually shifted partially in an attempt to break through the glass, Leonidus had ended the test with a roar that sent every wolf in the facility to their knees in submission. The message had been unmistakable. She might be using her scent as a tactical weapon, but she belonged to the Lycan King, and anyone who forgot that fact would answer to him personally. The incident had led to their first real argument, conducted in the privacy of his quarters with voices raised and the mate bond pulling so tight it was almost painful. Logartha had accused him of undermining her autonomy by making territorial displays that suggested she needed his protection to function. Leonidus had countered that watching other males respond to her scent with predatory interest had triggered instincts he could barely control, and that she needed to understand the risk she was taking by deliberately exposing herself to that kind of attention. The argument had ended when Logartha had closed the distance between them and kissed him with a desperation that surprised them both. The mate bond had flared so intensely that for several heartbeats she forgot how to breathe, forgot everything except the taste of him and the way his hands came up to cradle her face like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, both of them shaking with the effort of not taking things further than either of them was ready for, Leonidus had pressed his forehead against hers and whispered that he was terrified of losing her, and even more terrified of his own need to claim her completely. They had established boundaries after that. Touch was permitted but carefully controlled. Kissing was allowed but required both of them to maintain enough awareness to stop before instinct overrode choice. They slept in separate quarters because the temptation to complete the mate bond was strong enough that proximity made restraint nearly impossible. It was frustrating and necessary in equal measure, this dance between biology and conscious decision, but Logartha found herself respecting Leonidus more for his willingness to wait rather than less. The morning of the summit arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Logartha dressed in the simple gray gown that had been selected specifically for its lack of adornment. She had been taking carefully reduced doses of a mild suppressant for the past week, enough to keep her scent manageable during transport, but timed to metabolize completely during the Union toast. The calculation was precise, the margin for error minimal, and the potential consequences catastrophic if the timing failed. Cale met her in the corridor outside her quarters, his medical kit present as always, but his expression was different today. There was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of someone preparing for combat rather than a diplomatic gathering, and when he checked her vitals, his hands moved with the efficiency of a medic who expected to be working under fire soon. "How are you feeling?" And I am asking both medically and personally, because both matter for what we are about to attempt. Logartha considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her physical and emotional state with the clinical detachment that had kept her alive for 5 years of deep cover. "Medically, I am as ready as I am going to be. The suppressant is at exactly the level we calculated, and my body is responding well. Personally, I am terrified and determined in equal measure. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, and then I remember why we are doing it, and the fear becomes manageable." She paused, then added with more honesty than she had intended, "I am also worried about Leonidus. The mate bond is going to make this harder for him than it would be for an unmated king conducting the same operation. When my scent is fully released and other alphas react to it, his wolf is going to demand he eliminate the competition. We need to have plans in place to prevent him from doing something that will derail the entire strategy." Cale nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he had been thinking along the same lines. "Marcus has already briefed the Sentinels on potential scenarios where the king's judgment might be compromised by mate bond imperatives. We have protocols in place to intervene if necessary, though I suspect Leonidus will not appreciate being managed like a tactical asset with diminished capacity." They walked through the Citadel's corridors toward the courtyard where the vehicles waited, and Logartha felt the mate bond stretching as the physical distance between her and Leonidas increased. He was already at the summit venue with Marcus and Royce, establishing the security perimeter and positioning surveillance equipment. The separation had been his idea, a recognition that if they traveled together, his wolf would be too focused on her safety to maintain proper tactical awareness. The summit venue was exactly as the intelligence reports had described, a neutral territory estate designed to accommodate hundreds of guests and their security details. But seeing it in person, feeling the density of predatory energy concentrated in one location, made Logartha's wolf press closer to the surface with an unease that bordered on alarm. There were too many alphas in too small a space, their territorial instincts barely contained by the diplomatic protocols that governed these gatherings. She arrived in a separate vehicle from Leonidus, sitting beside Tywin in a silence that was thick with mutual resentment and pragmatic cooperation. Her father looked older than she remembered, stress and desperation aging him in ways that would have been impossible for a healthy shifter. He did not speak to her during the drive, and she made no attempt at conversation, both of them understanding that they were actors in a play that would determine the future of their species. The main ballroom was already crowded when they entered, and Logartha moved through the space in Tywin's wake with practiced subservience. The air was thick with competing scents, each alpha marking territory with pheromone signatures that spoke of power and barely controlled aggression. She kept her eyes downcast and her posture submissive, playing the role she had perfected over 5 years, but her awareness was cataloging everything. She caught glimpses of the sentinels positioned throughout the room. Marcus stood near the eastern exit with the rigid posture of a bodyguard, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Kael moved through the crowd with a serving tray, his medical kit concealed beneath a modified waiter's jacket. Royce was stationed near the kitchens, coordinating communications via encrypted earpiece. Darius remained in a converted utility room, monitoring surveillance feeds and tracking target movements. And then there was Leonidus, entering last with the formal ceremony that befitted his rank. The conversations in the ballroom did not stop, but they modulated, attention shifting as the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories took his place at the head table. His eyes found hers across the crowded space, and even at this distance, Logartha felt the mate bond flare with an intensity that made her breath catch. The hunger in his expression was carefully controlled but unmistakable, his wolf recognizing its mate and demanding acknowledgement, even though tactical necessity required distance. She broke eye contact first, reminding herself that maintaining the fiction of her worthlessness was essential to the plan's success. But the loss of that connection felt like a physical ache, the mate bond protesting the pretense of indifference with a pull that made her chest tight. The first hour of the summit proceeded according to standard diplomatic protocols, and Logartha used the time to identify the targets they had discussed during planning sessions. Beta Harkin was there, his scarred face immediately recognizable, holding court with smaller pack leaders and projecting confidence that suggested he had no idea his entire operation was about to be exposed. She marked the other known traffickers, noting their positions and their associations, building a mental map that would be crucial when the chaos started. The mate bond stretched and pulled as Leonidas conducted his diplomatic duties, shaking hands and negotiating alliances with the same controlled professionalism he brought to all political theater. But Logartha could feel his awareness of her even when he was not looking in her direction, could sense the way his wolf tracked her movements through the crowd with a precision that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with their connection. The Union toast was called at the beginning of the second hour, and Tywin stood to announce his alliance with Harkin. The words were carefully chosen to emphasize territorial expansion and mutual defense, making no mention of the fact that the primary asset being transferred was his daughter. Harkin rose from his seat with a smile that made Logartha's skin crawl, moving toward her with the confidence of someone who believed the transaction was already complete. She could feel the suppressant beginning to fail right on schedule, the internal barriers that had kept her scent contained starting to crack under the combined stress of the environment and the carefully calibrated timing. Her heart rate accelerated, her skin flushing with heat that was part withdrawal and part the first stirrings of a biological response she had been suppressing for far too long. The mate bond pulled at her with increasing urgency, her wolf demanding she close the distance to Leonidus and seek protection from the male who had already claimed her on every level that mattered. The servers began distributing glasses of dark wine, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Logartha accepted her glass with hands that trembled slightly, and she saw Leonidus's posture shift across the room, his attention zeroing in on her with a focus that suggested he had noticed the change in her scent, even through the lingering suppressant. The moment stretched as all 47 alphas raised their glasses in unison, the traditional words of alliance sealing contracts and confirming arrangements. Logartha raised her glass with the others, and as the wine touched her lips, she felt the final remnants of the suppressant fail completely. Her wolf surged forward with a power that was almost violent, 5 years of forced dormancy ending in an explosion of awareness that left her gasping. The scent that released from her was not subtle. It filled the ballroom like a living presence. Star jasmine and wildfire concentrated enough to bypass conscious thought and strike directly at the hindbrain where instinct lived. The effect was immediate and total. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses lowered before the toast could be completed. Every unmated male in the room turned toward her with eyes that glowed with predatory light, their wolves responding to the presence of a true Luna with hunger that overrode centuries of civilized behavior. But the mated males reacted too, Leonidus most of all. Across the crowded ballroom, Logartha felt him freeze, felt the exact moment when the full force of her unmasked scent reached him, and his wolf recognized what it had been waiting over a century to find. The mate bond, which had been a constant pull for the past 3 weeks, suddenly became a roar of absolute certainty. She was his, he was hers, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that he needed to eliminate the competition and claim her before someone else tried to take what belonged to him. Harkin was closest, and his reaction was the most visible. His entire body went rigid, nostrils flaring as he drew in her scent with an expression that combined hunger and recognition and something that looked dangerously like triumph. He reached for her with one hand already extended, his fingers curling in anticipation of contact, and Logartha felt the mate bond stretch to breaking as Leonidus fought against the urge to cross the room and tear Harkin apart for daring to touch his mate. 3 other alphas moved forward almost simultaneously, drawn by biological imperative that had nothing to do with tactical planning. Logartha cataloged their faces with the trained observation that had kept her alive during 5 years of deep cover. Talus from the Southern Territories, whose mining operations funded trafficking networks. Vorenus from the East, whose financial records showed suspicious payments. Carrion, a minor alpha whose forward movement confirmed suspicions that had previously been based on incomplete intelligence. Darius's voice came through the encrypted earpiece that Kale wore, transmitted to the other Sentinels via their hidden communication network. 14 confirmed contacts showing interest, recording all interactions, database flagging hand signals consistent with trafficking protocol. The king is holding position, but his control is deteriorating. Recommend immediate intervention if the situation escalates. Marcus's response was calm but carried an edge that suggested he was prepared for violence. Kale, move to extraction position. Royce, confirm exfil route is clear. All units maintain readiness. The king will signal when he is ready to proceed. But Logartha could feel through the mate bond that Leonidus was not ready to proceed with anything except claiming her. His wolf had been patient for 3 weeks, had allowed her the space and time to heal and to choose. But faced with the reality of other males responding to her scent with obvious intent to possess, that patience was disintegrating. She could feel his rage building like a physical pressure in her chest, could sense the exact moment when his tactical discipline began to fracture under the weight of instincts that were far older than strategy. Harkin reached her first, his hand closing on her upper arm with a grip that was just short of painful. His face was close enough that she could smell the aggression rolling off him in waves, could see the scar tissue from old fights and the absolute certainty that she belonged to him by virtue of prior arrangement. The contract is sealed. The girl comes with me. Any challenges to this arrangement will be considered violations of summit protocols and dealt with accordingly. The possessive language, the casual dismissal of her autonomy, the assumption that she was property to be transferred like livestock, All of it was expected and documented and exactly what they needed for evidence. But it also triggered something visceral in Logartha's newly awakened wolf, a fury that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with refusing to be claimed by anyone except the mate her biology had already chosen. Talus moved to block Harkon's path to the exit, his considerable size making him a physical obstacle that could not be easily dismissed. I was not aware that contracts involving true Lunas could be negotiated without the involvement of the Luna Council. Perhaps we should pause these proceedings and seek proper authorization before any transfers occur. It was a transparent delaying tactic designed to create space for counteroffers, and Harkon recognized it immediately. His expression shifted from triumph to fury, his grip on Logartha tightening enough that she felt bones grind together. She did not cry out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction, but the mate bond transmitted her pain directly to Leonidus with a clarity that bypassed all conscious filters. Across the ballroom, the Lycan King rose from his seat with a movement so fluid it looked like water flowing upward. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as his presence expanded to fill the space, his wolf no longer contained by civilized pretense. He did not speak. He did not need to. The sheer weight of his dominance was enough to make every wolf in the room respond with reflexive submission, their bodies recognizing apex predator and reacting accordingly. But Harkon was too far gone into his own aggression to recognize the danger, too focused on maintaining control of what he saw as his property. He pulled a small electronic device from his jacket pocket, holding it up so everyone could see the blinking red light on its surface. I had hoped we could conduct this transaction in a civilized manner, but it appears some of you need a reminder about the consequences of interfering in established contracts. The device I am holding is a remote detonator. There are currently explosives placed throughout this facility. If anyone attempts to prevent me from leaving with what is mine, I will detonate all charges simultaneously. The ballroom went silent in a way that was qualitatively different from before. This was not predatory focus. This was the silence of people calculating acceptable losses and wondering if the person beside them was willing to call what might be a bluff. Logartha felt the tactical assessment shift immediately, felt Leonidus freeze across the room in a way that had nothing to do with the detonator and everything to do with trauma response. She understood immediately what was happening. This was Celine again. This was the choice between saving one person and saving many. This was the moment when Leonidus would have to decide whether she was worth the lives of innocents, and the paralysis she could feel through the mate bond told her that he was caught in the past, unable to move forward because every option led to failure. Time compressed in the way it did during combat, and Logartha made her decision with the same cold calculation she had used to survive 5 years of deep cover. She could not wait for Leonidus to break through his paralysis. She could not trust that someone else would find a solution before Harkon's patience ran out. She had to act, had to take the choice away from her mate and place it on her own shoulders. She closed her eyes and reached for her wolf with an urgency that bypassed caution. The shift was agonizing, her body trying to change while still recovering from years of suppression. Bones began to restructure without completing the process, leaving her caught between forms in a way that was wrong on every level. But with the incomplete shift came access to abilities that existed outside normal human parameters. She opened her eyes knowing they would glow with golden luna light, and she released her aura not as attraction, but as its inverse. Pure, concentrated fear, the biological warning that told every wolf in the room that continuing their current course would result in death. It was the aura of a Luna defending her chosen mate, and it carried a weight that could not be ignored. The alphas closest to her froze as their wolves reacted to contradictory signals, unable to decide between advance and retreat. But Harkon was too angry, too committed to his plan to be swayed by biological warnings. He raised the detonator higher, his thumb moving toward the trigger. Logartha moved without conscious thought, her partially shifted body producing a burst of speed that carried her forward faster than Harkon could track. She hit him with her shoulder, using momentum to drive him backward and disrupt his grip on the detonator. They crashed into a table that collapsed under their combined weight with a sound like thunder. The detonator flew from Harkon's hand, skittering across marble floors, and Logartha saw Kale lunge for it with medic reflexes while Royce moved to provide support. But Harkin was not finished fighting. He rolled, trying to pin her beneath him, his hands going for her throat with clear intent to choke her unconscious. And then Leonidus was there, moving with a speed that suggested he had teleported rather than crossed the distance physically. His hand closed around Harkin's throat with enough force to lift the beta off the ground, and the roar that emerged from the Lycan King was not tactical or political. It was the sound of a mate bond pushed past breaking, of a wolf that had found its other half and would slaughter anyone who threatened that connection. The sound reverberated through the ballroom with a force that shattered crystal and cracked stone, and every shifter present went to their knees in response to a dominance display that transcended rank and went straight to the oldest part of their biology. Harkin struggled against the grip on his throat, but Leonidus was not operating on human strength anymore. He was pure Lycan fury, and the only thing keeping Harkin alive was Logartha's hand on Leonidus's arm. "Do not kill him. We need him to testify, please." The mate bond carried her plea with an intensity that cut through rage, and Logartha felt Leonidus fight for control with a desperation that made his whole body shake. Slowly, incrementally, he lowered Harkin to the ground, but did not release his throat. His voice when he spoke was barely recognizable, scraped raw by the effort of maintaining any humanity at all. "You put your hands on my mate. You threatened her life. You attempted to use terrorism to claim what belongs to me by right of bond and choice. Give me one reason why I should not end you here and now." Harkin could not speak, with Leonidus's hand still crushing his windpipe, but his eyes held genuine terror now, the understanding that he had pushed a force of nature past its tolerance and was about to pay the price. Cale's voice cut through the tension, calm and clinical. "Sir, the detonator has been disarmed. Royce's team is locating and neutralizing the charges. No one is in immediate danger. You can release him now." Leonidus did not move for several heartbeats, his grip remaining constant while he fought for the control necessary to make rational decisions. When he finally released Harkin, dropping him to the floor like discarded trash, his attention shifted immediately to Logartha. She was still on the ground where she had fallen during the fight, her partial shift receding, but leaving her shaking with exhaustion and pain. Leonidus dropped to his knees beside her, with a grace that belied his size, his hands moving over her body with a gentleness that was almost heartbreaking after the violence of seconds before. "Are you injured? Did he hurt you? Tell me what you need." The questions came in a rush, his tactical composure completely demolished by the combination of mate bond and adrenaline. Logartha managed a weak smile despite the pain radiating through her ribs. "I need you to finish what we started. The evidence is recorded. The targets are identified. Make them understand what they have been complicit in." Leonidus looked at her with eyes that held a century of loneliness and the fierce joy of having found something worth protecting, and then he stood and turned to face the assembled alphas, who were still kneeling in response to his earlier roar. His voice when he spoke carried the weight of absolute authority, but it also carried something new. Pride in his mate, recognition of her strength, acknowledgement that she had saved him from repeating his greatest failure. "Beta Harkin, you have violated summit protocols by threatening innocent lives, by attempting to coerce transfer through terrorism, and by putting your hands on a mated Luna without her consent. You are hereby stripped of rank and will be held pending trial. The charges against you include conspiracy to commit mass murder, human trafficking, and assault on a Luna under sovereign protection." He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled pack leaders, with a precision that suggested he was marking each face for future reference. "This woman is not property. She is not a contract to be negotiated or a resource to be traded. She is Logartha, true Luna, my acknowledged mate, and a trained operative who has spent 5 years documenting the trafficking networks that many of you have participated in, either directly or through willful ignorance. The evidence gathered during this summit, combined with her 5 years of intelligence work, will be submitted to the Interpack Tribunal. Those of you who are implicated will answer for your crimes." The ballroom erupted into protests and denials, but Leonidus simply raised one hand and the room fell silent again, responding to command presence that had been honed over more than a century of rule. But the trafficking networks themselves are not the primary threat we face today. They are symptoms of a larger disease. An organization many of you know as the Shadow Council has been systematically taking control of these networks, not to dismantle them, but to centralize them under a single authority that answers to no pack law and serves no interest except its own accumulation of power. Darius emerged from his monitoring station carrying a laptop displaying documentation that Logartha recognized from her debriefing sessions. The tech specialist connected the device to the ballroom's projection system, and the walls lit up with evidence that was damning in its comprehensiveness. Financial records, communication intercepts, internal memos, and at the center of it all, maps showing the trafficking routes Logartha had spent 5 years documenting, annotated with Shadow Council operational plans. This is what we are facing. Not individual criminals, but systemic corruption. The choice before you is whether you join the coalition to dismantle this infrastructure or whether you maintain profitable ignorance and hope the problem does not reach your territories. But understand that neutrality is complicity. Your silence endorses the continuation of these operations. Choose wisely. The arguments began immediately. Alphas forming alliances and making calculations about how the revelation affected their positions. 23 departed within the hour, their expressions troubled, but their decisions apparently made. The remaining 24 stayed, and by midnight they had formed a coalition that was fragile but functional. Through it all, Logartha remained where Leonidus had left her, too exhausted to move and content to watch the alliance building from her position on the floor. Kale had checked her injuries and determined nothing was broken, though she would be bruised for weeks. The mate bond hummed with Leonidus's awareness of her, even as he negotiated and planned, a constant thread of connection that told her he was tracking her condition with part of his attention. When the last of the coordination meetings concluded, and the ballroom finally began to empty, Leonidus returned to where she sat. He did not ask permission before lifting her into his arms, cradling her against his chest with a possessiveness that made his wolf practically purr with satisfaction. "You should not have moved. That was not part of the plan. You could have been killed." His tone was harsh, but underneath the anger was fear that had been transformed into aggression because vulnerability was not something kings were supposed to show in public. Logartha leaned her head against his shoulder, too tired to do anything except tell him the truth. "You were frozen. The mate bond showed me that you were back in that moment with Celine, unable to choose, so I chose for you. And yes, I could have died, but I did not, and now we have what we came for. You can be angry about it later. Right now, I just need you to take me somewhere safe so I can sleep for approximately 3 days." Leonidus carried her through corridors that were being cleared by security teams, his stride never faltering despite her weight and his own exhaustion. When they reached a private suite that had been prepared for exactly this contingency, he laid her on the bed with a care that suggested she was made of spun glass. He started to pull away, to give her the space she had requested over the past 3 weeks, but Logartha's hand shot out and caught his wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong given her condition. "Stay. Please. I do not want to complete the mate bond tonight because I can barely keep my eyes open. But I do not want to be alone either. Can we find a middle ground?" Leonidus looked at her with eyes that held a question he had been afraid to ask, and she saw the exact moment when hope overcame caution. "Are you saying you want to accept the bond? Not tonight, but eventually. That this is not just biology for you anymore." Logartha pulled him down to sit on the edge of the bed, using their joined hands to keep him close. "I am saying that over the past 3 weeks I have fallen in love with a king who respects my autonomy even when his wolf demands possession. Who trusts my competence even when his instinct is to protect, who is honest about his limitations instead of pretending they do not exist." The mate bond accelerated the process, but this feeling is mine, not just biology. So yes, I want to accept the bond, when we are both ready, when it can be a choice we make together rather than a response to crisis. The tension drained from Leonidus's shoulders, and he moved carefully to lie beside her on the bed, close enough to touch, but maintaining the boundaries they had established. His hand found hers in the space between them, fingers interlacing in the gesture that had become their compromise between distance and contact. "I have waited over a century. I can wait a few more weeks if that is what you need." Logartha smiled against his shoulder, feeling the mate bond settle into contentment. Make it a few more days. I am patient, but not that patient, and after tonight, I think we have both earned the right to claim what belongs to us." They fell asleep like that, hands joined and hearts aligned, while outside the suite, the political ramifications of the summit continued to unfold. But for this moment, in the quiet dark with the mate bond humming between them like a promise, nothing else mattered except the fact that they had found each other and chosen to build something real from the connection fate had provided. When Logartha woke, pale sunlight streamed through windows, and Leonidus was no longer beside her. The mate bond told her he was close, and she followed that pull to find him on a balcony overlooking the summit grounds. He looked exhausted, the post-combat tension of adrenaline crash combined with a mind still running scenarios. She moved to stand beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her waist immediately, pulling her close with possessiveness that no longer felt threatening. This was connection, the mate bond seeking confirmation they were both safe. "How many stayed?" Her voice was rough from sleep and the partial shift. Leonidus pressed water into her hand before answering. 24 alphas committed to the coalition. 23 refused and departed. It is not as many as I hoped, but enough to begin coordinated operations. Marcus has already started planning raids targeting the most vulnerable network nodes. He paused, his jaw tightening with something that looked like anger directed inward. I froze last night. When Harkin pulled that detonator, I was back in that room 80 years ago, watching Celine beg me to choose the mission over her safety. I could not move, could not think, could not do anything except replay every failure and calculate how this one would destroy me. You saved me from that paralysis. You made the choice I could not make, and you did it without hesitation. Logartha set down the water glass and turned to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his face the way he had done for her so many times. You did not fail Celine because you chose wrong. You failed her because you thought there was a right answer to an impossible question. Last night there was no right answer either. Harkin could have detonated those charges whether I acted or waited. People could have died regardless of what decision was made. But I chose to act because action felt better than paralysis, not because I had some tactical certainty you lacked. She pulled his forehead down to rest against hers, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. You need to forgive yourself for Celine, not because what happened was not tragic, but because carrying that guilt for 80 years has not brought her back and is preventing you from being present for the people who are still here, including me. Leonidus's eyes closed, and she felt moisture on her hands that suggested he was finally letting himself grieve properly instead of burying it under tactical analysis. I do not know if I can forgive myself, but I can try to do better. I can try to trust that the people I care about are competent enough to make their own choices, even when those choices terrify me. They stood like that for several minutes, the mate bond wrapping around them like a warm blanket, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them felt lighter somehow. The past could not be changed, but its hold on the present could be loosened through acknowledgement and conscious choice to move forward. Marcus appeared in his doorway, expression carefully neutral. "Sir, we have a situation. The Shadow Council sent a representative requesting audience. They want Logartha present." The meeting was brief but revealing. The Shadow Council representative, Mira Castell, explained that an internal faction had been fighting corruption within the council, and that Logartha's extraction had been deliberately orchestrated to protect her from the corrupt elements. They needed her testimony for internal trials. Logartha agreed on strict conditions: neutral territory, immunity, and no further contact after trials concluded. Castell accepted immediately, leaving documentation that confirmed the opposition faction had used Logartha's intelligence to save lives, even while the corrupt faction tried to pervert her work. The next 3 days brought legal proceedings, tactical planning, and coordinated raids against trafficking networks. Beta Harkin was formally charged, his networks dismantled. Alpha Tywin quietly retired. The 14 alphas from the summit faced varying scrutiny. Through it all, the mate bond between Logartha and Leonidus deepened into genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They spent hours planning strategy, recovering from injuries, and in quiet moments simply existing together. On the 4th morning, Logartha woke in her citadel quarters, feeling safe for the first time in 5 years. Not just physically protected, but emotionally secure. She found Leonidus at his desk, surrounded by reports. "I have been thinking about accepting the bond. Are you ready, or do you need more time?" Logartha crossed to stand beside his chair, her hand on his shoulder. "I am ready. Not because the bond demands it, but because I choose you. I choose this partnership we are building. I choose to claim you as my mate the same way you have been so patient about letting me claim you in return." Leonidus rose from his chair with a grace that belied his size, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her chest tight. "Then let me take you somewhere private, somewhere that belongs to just us, and let me show you exactly how much you mean to me. Not as an asset I extracted or a tactical advantage I gained, but as my mate, my partner, and the woman I have been waiting over a century to find." The claiming that followed was everything the mate bond had promised, and more. It was fierce and gentle and overwhelming in the best possible way, biology and choice merging into something that transcended both. And when it was complete, when they lay tangled together in a bed that smelled of them both and carried the mark of their union, Logartha felt the mate bond settle into absolute certainty. This was home. Not the citadel or any physical location, but this connection with this person who saw her as whole and valuable and worthy of partnership. The journey from that sub-level room in Northridge to this moment had been painful and terrifying and transformative, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. The story was not over. There would be trials and tactical operations and political maneuvering ahead, but they would face it together, King and Luna, tactical partners and mates, building something that would outlast the current crisis and create a foundation for genuine change. And that beginning felt like the most important victory they had won yet.